Arrogant young man refuses to give up his seat for an elderly woman, but the driver stops, and there are things you see in everyday life that stay with you for a long time. The kind of situation that seems small, but says a lot about who we are. And this story I'm about to tell you is exactly about that. About a moment on a crowded bus that changed much more than just a seat. It was a Monday morning, one of those where the heat is already present before 8 o'clock, and the bus seems to swallow people instead of transporting them. The line that ran from downtown to the Silver Oaks neighborhood was known for always being packed, and that day was no different. Every aisle had people squeezed together, arms raised holding the handrail, purses on laps, eyes on their phones. It was at that moment that the rear door opened at yet another stop, and Mrs. Martha got on. She took a little longer than the others to climb the step. Her hands, wrinkled and firm at the same time, gripped the cold metal handrail, and she pulled her own body up with a silent determination. 82 years carried in a petite frame, with white hair pinned back, wearing a beige cardigan over a red blouse. Her eyes had a restless gleam, like someone thinking about something important while the world goes by around her. She looked inside the bus and saw what everyone there already knew. There was no seat available, but she didn't complain. She simply positioned herself in the aisle, held the metal handrail with both hands, and stood there, on her feet, balancing her own weight as the vehicle swayed with every jolt of the pothole-riddled asphalt. On the right side, just a few inches from her, sat a young man. A guy around 25, dark-skinned, short, well-groomed hair, wearing a moss-green t-shirt. He had his arms crossed over his chest, eyes fixed on the window, with a closed expression that mixed stubbornness with something deeper, something hidden. The kind of face that looks like it's fighting with something no one else can see. He saw Mrs. Martha. That was clear to anyone who was watching. His eyes passed over the old woman's figure for a split second and went back to the window. His arms crossed a little tighter, and the bus kept going. Other passengers noticed. A younger woman in a floral dress kept staring at the young man with that look that doesn't need words to say everything. An older man in a grey sweater standing further back shook his head slightly, but no one said anything. Sometimes collective silence is the heaviest thing that exists in a confined space. Mrs. Martha didn't ask for anything. She wasn't the type to ask. She had lived 82 years without extending her hand to anyone, and she wasn't about to start now. But the bus braked suddenly at a poorly marked speed bump, and her body swayed with a violence that startled the people around her. She held onto the handrail tightly, her knuckles turning white, and stood there, steady, as if the whole world could shake, and she would hold on. The woman in the floral dress opened her mouth to say something to the young man in the green t-shirt. But before she could, something happened that no one expected. The bus stopped. It wasn't a scheduled stop. There was no bus stop there. The driver simply pulled the vehicle over to the curb, slowly, and turned off the blinker. People looked at each other, confused. Someone at the back asked out loud if there was a problem with the vehicle. But the problem wasn't with the vehicle. Mr. George was 63 years old, had been licensed for 41 years, and had been driving this specific line for 18. He was a sturdy man, with dark skin, greying hair at the temples, with the patience of someone who had learned that his job was more than just driving. In that fogged-up rearview mirror, he had a privileged view of everything that happened on the bus, and he had been watching that scene since the moment Mrs. Martha got on. He got up slowly from the driver's seat. He walked down the aisle with steady steps, in no hurry. People cleared the way without quite knowing what was going on. When he reached the young man in the green t-shirt, he stopped. He stood there looking down at the young man. The silence on the bus was different now. It was the kind that hurts a little. The young man looked at the driver, and for the first time since the bus had left, the hardness on his face wavered a bit. Mr. George didn't yell. He didn't make a scene. He spoke in a low voice, the way someone who doesn't need volume to be heard does. "Son," he said, "do you see this lady here?" The young man didn't answer right away. He looked away quickly, then looked back. "I'm not obligated to get up," he said, in a voice that tried to be firm, but came out slightly cracked in the middle. "There's a law, but it's not a law that forces everyone to—" "I know the law," Mr. George interrupted, still slowly. "I didn't come here to talk about the law with you. I came to talk about something else." The young man clenched his jaw, crossed his arms again. "I'm in a hurry," he said. "I need to get to an important place." "So does she," Mr. George answered simply, and he stood there waiting. "Look, when I first read this part, I paused for a while before continuing, because sometimes the most powerful confrontation isn't the one with shouting, it's the one with silence and a steady person standing inside it." The young man, whose name was Tyler, had his heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with the argument. Ever since before he got on the bus, ever since his phone had rung at home that morning, he'd been in a state he himself couldn't name. It was as if the ground had been pulled out from under his feet, and he was still pretending he was standing. The call had been from his Aunt Susan. And what Aunt Susan had said changed the tone of that whole Monday in an instant. His mother was in the hospital. She'd gotten sick during the night. It wasn't serious enough for him to panic, but it was serious enough to make everything feel urgent, and too heavy. Tyler had left home in a state that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite despair, but was somewhere in between that makes you blind to everything happening around you. He hadn't even really noticed that he was sitting while that white-haired lady stood next to him. But Mr. George was there, and the bus was stopped, and everyone was watching. Tyler looked at Mrs. Martha for the first time, really. Her eyes were fixed on him. It wasn't an accusing look. It was something different, almost as if she was waiting for something from him that went beyond the seat. He got up. He didn't say anything. He just stood and moved to take a spot in the aisle, gripping the handrail the same way she had. Mr. George watched him for a moment, gave a nearly imperceptible nod, and went back to the driver's seat. In less than a minute, the bus was moving again. The woman in the floral dress let out a sigh that seemed like it had been held in for a long time. The man in the grey sweater closed his eyes and went back to swaying gently with the motion of the vehicle. Mrs. Martha sat down on the still warm seat and placed her purse in her lap. She stayed quiet for a moment, looked at her own hands. Then she looked at the young man who was now standing beside her, with that still closed face, that expression of someone carrying something that wouldn't fit in their chest. "Where are you in such a hurry to get to?" she asked. Tyler looked at her, not wanting to answer. "The hospital," he said, not fully knowing why he was speaking. Mrs. Martha didn't say, "How sad," or "Poor thing." She just nodded slowly, as if that explained a great deal. "Your mother?" she asked. He looked at her more closely now. How had she guessed? "Yes," he answered. She nodded again and kept staring ahead. "I'm going to see my son," she said after a while. Tyler didn't answer, but something in his face shifted slightly. "It's been 15 years since I've seen him," she went on, as if she were telling the window instead of him. 15 years? That's not a short time, no. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like, and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, back to the story. 15 years. I had to take a deep breath here, because that number carries weight. 15 years is more than time. It's a whole lifetime of things left unsaid. The story of Mrs. Martha and her son, whose name was Stephen, wasn't one of those stories that starts with a single moment. It had been building for years, with every small choice the two of them had made, with every harsh word that had been thrown into the air and never taken back. Stephen had married a woman Mrs. Martha had never liked much, not out of malice, but because Mrs. Martha was the type who feels something the first time she looks at people, and what she felt when she met Chloe, her daughter-in-law, was a coldness she couldn't name but also couldn't ignore. And then the years came. The holiday gatherings where the conversations were short, the phone calls that took longer and longer to happen, the grandson who grew up and she barely got to know, and one specific fight 15 years ago at a Sunday lunch that should have been simple that became the wall between the two of them. She had said things, Stephen had said things, and the two of them had left that lunch without saying goodbye, and the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, and the months turned into a decade and a half of silence. But Mrs. Martha had received a letter, a paper letter, handwritten by Stephen himself, that arrived on a Saturday morning as if it had travelled from very far away just to reach her, and in the letter he said he was sorry, that he missed her, that he wanted to see her. And she was on that bus because she had decided to go. It wasn't an easy decision. It was 82 years of pride, and pride is a thing that gets stuck to your bones over time. But she had read that letter 3 times, 4 times, and on the 5th time she had put it in her cardigan pocket and called Stephen. The conversation lasted 17 minutes, and when she hung up, she cried alone in the kitchen, with her back to the door, the way you cry when you don't want anyone to see. Tyler listened to all of it, without realizing he was listening. Mrs. Martha's words came in like they didn't want to intrude, but they stayed. 15 years is a lot of time to lose, she said. Yeah, he agreed, almost without meaning to. But time lost with someone you love isn't really lost, she went on. It's time that's been waiting for us to find each other again. Tyler looked at her. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the aisle up ahead, with that calm expression of someone who has made peace with a lot of things before getting there. My mother and I, Tyler started, and then stopped. Mrs. Martha waited. We weren't in a very good place, he said after a moment. Before she got sick, we had fought, weeks ago, something silly that got way too big. It always does, she said simply. And now I keep thinking, he went on, his voice becoming a little less steady, that if I had called her sooner, if I had fixed things right away, she wouldn't be going through all of this alone. Mrs. Martha looked at him sideways. That has nothing to do with one thing and the other, she said, with a frankness that held no cruelty. You know that. He does. But when we're scared, guilt slips through any crack that reason leaves open. Tyler stayed quiet for a long time after that. He looked out the window. The streets passed by with that monotonous Monday rhythm, and he tried to remember the last time he had called his mother just to check on her. Not to ask for anything, not out of obligation, just to talk. It had been far too long. The fight between them had been about money, as so many fights are. He had needed to borrow some. His mother had given it, but with that condition she always added, that he move closer to her. And Tyler didn't want to. He had built his life in an apartment on the other side of the city. His friends were there, his routine was there, and his mother had been left with that silent hurt of someone who gives one way but receives another. And he had been left with the hurt of someone who feels controlled even when being helped. And they had both let the phone ring a few times without answering, and then they had stopped calling. Weeks turned into a month and a half. And then Aunt Susan called. In the back of the bus, Mr. George was watching the rearview mirror, not to keep tabs, just because it was his way of knowing what was going on, and what he saw now was different from what he had seen 20 minutes ago. The young man in the green t-shirt was standing, yes, but he no longer had his arms crossed. He had his hand on the railing, and his face turned toward the elderly woman who had given up her seat, and the two of them were talking. Mr. George let out a slow breath through his nose, that kind of thing that seems small, but carries a weight only those with an elderly mother can understand. His own mother, Mrs. Dorothy, was 88 years old and lived in a small town upstate, at the home of one of his sisters. He visited her whenever he could, which was less than he should. Work, the distance, the rush. There was always some reason for the month to go by before he could make the trip, and every time he hit the road to see her, he remembered he had stayed away too long for too long, and he felt that tightness that isn't quite guilt and isn't quite longing, but both at once. Some days he drove this bus and kept thinking that every elderly woman who boarded could be his mother, and that someone on some bus far away must be taking care of her or ignoring her, and he would never know. That's why he had stopped the vehicle, not because of the rules, because of something that had been inside his chest for years. The bus went past 2 more stops. People got off and got on. The aisle became a little less crowded, and at some point Tyler found a spot and sat down on the seat across from Mrs. Martha, the two of them separated by the narrow aisle. "How much longer is the ride?" she asked him. "About 3 stops, he answered. "The hospital is near the intersection with Pine Street." She nodded. Mine is in the opposite direction. I still have about 8 stops. He looked at her. Are you going to let yourself get off alone? I've been going everywhere alone for many years, she replied with a short smile. Tyler was quiet for a second. Then he asked, Are you scared to go? The question came out before he could think about whether it was appropriate. Mrs. Martha looked at him as if he had touched something she was still trying to sort out inside herself. I am, she said, with an honesty that completely disarmed him. But fear isn't a reason not to go. He kept looking at her. Where did you learn that? She thought for a moment. By living, she said. It's the only way to truly learn. And then the bus braked at his stop. Tyler stood up, grabbed the small backpack that was on his lap, stood there for a second in the aisle looking at her. I hope it goes well, he said. I hope the same for you, she replied. And then he got off. He stood on the sidewalk watching the bus pull away. Through the window, he saw Mrs. Martha's silhouette, that small, steady figure in a beige cardigan, looking forward with her chin slightly raised, and he had a strange urge to tell her that he was going to call his mother before even entering City General Hospital. Just to hear her voice, just to say he was on his way. He took his phone out of his pocket, dialed. His mother answered on the second ring as if she had been waiting. Tyler. Her voice was weak, but it was there. I'm coming, Mom, he said. I'm close. There was a pause. He heard his mother breathing on the other end. Stay calm, son, she said. I'm fine. He didn't answer right away because his throat had closed up in a way he didn't expect. Wait for me there, he managed to say. She made a small sound that could have been a yes, or could have been her trying not to cry too. He hung up and started walking. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us who are just starting out, now continuing. What happened at City General Hospital that morning, I'll tell you the way it was told to me. Because this story didn't end on the bus. It continued in the white hallways and the smell of antiseptic, and in the hard plastic chairs of the waiting rooms. Mrs. Eleanor, Tyler's mother, was 61 years old and had the same stubbornness as her son. She was a small woman with still dark hair who had worked her whole life at a local corner store and raised Tyler alone after his father left when he was 7. She didn't talk much about that. But the choices she had made since then, working more than her body could handle, saving money under the mattress, never asking for help, all of it came from that day she had been left alone with a child and a bill to pay. Tyler had grown up admiring her strength without ever saying it out loud, and she had carried his pride as both a weight and a joy at the same time. The fight the two of them had had a month and a half ago was the kind that starts over one thing and ends over another. It started with the borrowed money and the conditions she had set. But deep down, it was about years of unspoken expectations, about a son who needed space and a mother who needed closeness, and the two of them trying at the same time to understand each other and be understood, and failing at both. Tyler made his way down the corridor of City General Hospital, with his heart beating faster than he wanted to admit. Aunt Susan was sitting in one of the plastic chairs and stood up when she saw him. She's better, were the first words she said. Her blood pressure spiked in the middle of the night, but it's stabilized now. He let out a breath he had been holding for hours. Can I go in? Yes, she asked for you. That somehow hurt more than anything. His mother, even feeling unwell, even waking up in the middle of the night unable to breathe properly, had asked for him. He entered the room. Mrs. Eleanor was lying down with her eyes open, a plastic cap on her hair, an IV line in her arm. When he appeared at the door, she tried to sit up. Stay still, Mom, he said, going to her. You stay still, she replied, with that quickness that was so her. And the two of them stayed there for a second, looking at each other, with all the fight in between, with all the month and a half of silence between them, and with that thing that has no name, but is bigger than any fight and any silence. He pulled the chair close to the bed and sat down. I should have called before, he said. She stayed quiet. Me too, she admitted afterward. It wasn't a soap opera reconciliation. There was no dramatic hug at that moment, no prolonged crying, no elaborate speech. It was one sentence from one side and one sentence from the other, and the weight that left along with them. They kept talking for over 2 hours. About the fight. About the years before the fight. About what he wanted from life and what she was afraid of losing. She said things she had never said before. He heard things he had never heard before. And when the nurse came in to let them know she needed to check her vitals, Tyler was standing by the bed holding his mother's hand in his. I know it's a lot, but sometimes we need a scare to sit down and have the conversation we should have had a long time ago. While all of this was happening at the City General Hospital, Mrs. Martha's bus was arriving at the neighborhood where her son lived. Stephen was 48 years old, a little overweight, with his hair starting to thin at the temples, and he was waiting at the bus stop with a bouquet of yellow flowers he had bought at the corner newsstand because he didn't know what else to bring, and flowers seemed like the most honest thing he could offer. When Mrs. Martha got off the bus and saw him there, she stopped. 15 years is a long time. He was different. Older, yes, but also different on the inside, in a way she felt without being able to explain. The look in his eyes was less hard than it used to be. There was something there that seemed learned. He took a step toward her. "Mom." She stood still for a second, and then she went to him. It wasn't a low-key scene. She reached him with her small arms that seemed to have more strength than expected, and he wrapped her in his arms, the way you hold someone when you're afraid of losing them, and the two of them stayed there on the sidewalk while people walked by without paying them any mind. She cried. He cried. The yellow flowers got crushed in the middle of the hug. Chloe, the daughter-in-law, was at the apartment door when the two of them arrived. She was different too, softer than Mrs. Martha remembered, with a smile that seemed more real than the ones she had shown before. Time does that to people sometimes. It slowly smooths out the rough edges. And the grandson, Joshua, was 17 years old, with his grandmother's curious eyes. The grandmother he barely knew. He stayed in the living room with her for an hour, listening to stories that none of the adults around had thought to tell him. Mrs. Martha spent 3 days with them. They weren't 3 perfect days. There were moments of tension, topics that everyone steered away from because they were still too raw. But there was also the dinner table with everyone seated, and Joshua's voice asking his grandmother what the neighborhood was like when she was young, and her answering with a delight in storytelling that she didn't know she still had inside her. At the farewell, Stephen put her in the taxi himself. "Will you call when you get there?" he asked through the window. "I will," she said. "Promise?" She looked at him with that seriousness that wasn't hardness. "Stephen, I'm 82 years old. If I say I'm going to call, I call." He let out a laugh that seemed rusty from disuse, but it still came out beautiful. And the taxi drove off. Now about Mr. George, because this story wouldn't be complete without telling what happened to him. That night, after his shift, he called his sister in the countryside. He asked how their mother was doing. His sister said she was fine, that she was going to bed early, that she had been asking about him these days. He said he was going to visit at the end of the month. His sister said it would be better to come sooner. He went quiet. Then he said he'd go the following week. And he did. Mrs. Dorothy, 88 years old, was on the porch when he arrived in the afternoon with a bag of the fresh bagels she liked. She saw him coming down the sidewalk and kept looking at him with that smile that doesn't need teeth to be beautiful. "George," she said, as if his name were the most familiar word in the world, because it was. He sat down beside her on the porch. They stayed there until the sun went away, without needing much conversation, just needing what they needed. Sometimes life puts us in places we didn't want to be to remind us of where we should be. That crowded bus on an ordinary Monday had been that for 3 completely different people. A young man who needed to remember that hurt is no reason to let time slip by. A woman of 82 who needed to remember that courage has no expiration date. And a driver who needed to remember that certain small actions are the ones that weigh the most when we close our eyes at night. Tyler visited his mother every day while she was in the hospital. The visit started out awkward because they both still had to learn to talk without arguing. But they slowly got easier. And when Mrs. Eleanor was discharged 4 days later, Tyler was there to help carry the bag back home. They didn't work everything out in that time. That's not how it works. But they reached an agreement that didn't need to be said out loud. From now on, the phone would ring before the silence stretched on too long. And that's what matters. Not the perfect resolution, the beginning of the right habit. Mrs. Martha went back to her own home in the second week. With the photo taken at dinner saved on the phone she barely knew how to use, but which Joshua had set up for her in a way that made it easy to open the gallery. She called Stephen when she got home, as she had promised. The conversation lasted 45 minutes. They agreed he would visit her the following month, and Mr. George, the day after the weekend he spent in the countryside with his mother, went back to his usual route. Crowded bus, rear-view mirror, the faces he learned to read over 18 years on the route. At one of the mid-morning stops, a white-haired lady struggled up the step. He looked in the mirror. This time, a young man stood up before the driver even needed to do anything. The lady nodded in thanks and sat down. Mr. George turned his eyes forward. And the bus moved on. End of story. For me, what stays from this story is that we don't know what the other person is carrying when they get on a bus, walk into a waiting room or stand in a line. But we can choose to act with humanity anyway, without needing to know. And it's exactly that choice that changes the course of things, sometimes for far more people than we imagine. If this story touched you in any way, leave it here in the comments. Did you see yourself in any of the characters? Have you ever been in the shoes of someone in this story? Her, him, or the driver? Tell us. We read everything. Don't forget to like. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. Because there are more stories like this on the way.